Held up in a foreign land and in foreign quarters by the sudden onset of winter, a man is more than bored with the conversation available to him here, and shuts himself in a stove-heated room all day with only his thoughts, and then begins to question the validity of all those thoughts. He spent his life learning the greatest thoughts of the most established minds, but doubted that the products of so many minds, working to so many ends, could truly constitute truth. Hadn't they not conflicted and countered each other time and time again? Feeling the heat from the stove, this sensation entirely independent of his will, he doubted the product of so many senses, of bodies which could feel pain in a limb no longer even there, of eyes which often saw illusions and forced action as if they were real. Traveling across nations to be in this situation to begin with, he doubted the culture those bodies move about in, where each nation was closer to truth here and further there, matters of time, place, and the ease of a pre-trampled path. However, some things did appear as truths, not relationships between men, but between points and lines, and that 3 dimensions are always 3 dimensions, and that while 2 and 3 and 5 may be human words, what we call 2 objects and 3 objects will always sum to 5 objects. Alone in this room, the knowledge found in logic was all which could satisfy him. The things which we did not feel or create, but which we could discover with nothing more than the mind alone, even if they were often just taught to us. This led him to disembark from these pre-trampled paths and carve out his own. If nothing could be trusted, then nothing he would trust, casting out all knowledge from his mind to start again from the beginning. A man alone with only his logic and reason, what could possibly be established as undeniably true? To answer that question, there was only one starting point. Do I even exist? He felt as if he did. The cold he escaped from outside and the warmth of that stove inside seemed real, but he could just as easily feel them in a dream as in waking. In fact, many times he'd been deceived by this, convinced so delicately of a moment in his room moving this form by his own will, only to find himself still in bed. There was no way to truly know which end was reality, the solipsistic nightmare. However, this deceptive act was an important one. Say something or someone was deceiving him, his own sensations, a trickster god, whatever it may be, and he could never be certain that even the most real feelings or logic had any truth, then he would have to doubt everything. Except one thing, that he does exist, for how could something be deceived if there was nothing to deceive? The chair he sits on, the stove he feels warmth from, the room and building and country which surrounds may all be illusions, but the mind conceiving of them must be real. By the same logic, all the sensations and faculties by which he may be deceived must also exist, as they would be the means to do so, and so from this doubt he found the baseline for all the rest. He exists as a thinking being with sensations, logic and reason, and so on. So, knowing that he does exist, a simple question would then have to follow. How did he come to exist? And this is where we find the success and failure of gods. This story and the philosophy within comes from the Meditations of Rene Descartes, a rationalist philosopher from the 17th century. As we said, he doubted empirical evidence, like our sensations and experience, and believed that truth could be found in reason alone. This makes what he wrote a very interesting read from our modern perspective, something with many flaws, but also with a great capacity to make us more firm in our beliefs through its radical questioning. So today we'll be combining a few of his meditations, but namely focusing on the third one, concerning God, that he exists, to explain his logic, and then examine the natural consequences of it through some amazing stories. Would a God as described succeed or fail? Is perfection a tool or a goal? And would infinity be lonely? Let's get into his logic and see. To begin with, there must be a conception of God, which he lists as either an infinite or perfect substance, which seems to depend on translation because the original text is 17th century French, but essentially it means that this substance contains within it everything. Being everything, God would naturally then have to have the greatest amount of objective reality. And this is where reading old texts like this gets even more rough. Well, to us, objective means factual, existing like an object would, that I could pick up and feel, In Descartes' writings here, it pairs with reality to mean sort of like an idea, reality as an idea. The most objective reality is the idea with the most reality within it, not the most real physical thing. Believing this to be true of God, he hasn't yet proved that God is real, just that in the space of ideas, it would be the most real idea. Then he gets into what's been since dubbed as a misunderstanding of causality, but in his time was just an exploration of cause and effect. Where does this idea of God come from? What is the cause of this perceived effect? Because ideas are an effect. There are some which come from outside sources, that is, sensation, such as the sun. We feel its warmth, we see it in the sky rising and setting. We have an idea of it which is essentially against our will. We didn't choose to feel its warmth or not, it just happens to us. However, what we observe it isn't actually it. The sun isn't an orb smaller than the Earth floating around us. It's a massive star millions of miles away, which comes from the knowledge of astronomy contradicting our sensations. Once again, he believes we can't find those as the source of, well, anything, this time our idea of God. Now, there are ideas which we create that don't exist in reality, say a chimera. We take a bull, an eagle, a lion, and a snake, and we put them all together and get a new creature. But have we really? It might not exist in reality, but all of its parts do. We've merely stitched these together. Failing to find our thoughts, something we didn't first comprehend elsewhere, and knowing that perfection has never existed for us to comprehend, he finds our ideas also as unacceptable to have created the concept of God. Of course, he turns next to innate knowledge, such as mathematics. We don't create these principles, but discover them as they exist independent of our sensations and remain true in all cases. That is, they have an actual reality somewhere, which has created the objective reality of their ideas, a cause for this effect. As such, this is where he finds God must be, an innate idea coming from beyond us. Focusing on cause and effect, this transitions into how he believes cause and effect must function. The cause always has to be something greater, right? Something could not arise from nothing, after all. Consider the conservation of energy, the physical manifestation of this idea. When two objects collide, there is a total amount of energy in the system, the force which induces the velocity of the objects. They hit, some is lost to sound and heat and friction, and they split apart from that collision, each with some amount of that original energy remaining, but never more than it originally was. Over time, this amount of usable energy within the system, as if those two objects were in a box, falls, and the objects end up at rest. There is no more greater cause to lead to a lesser effect. Now, Descartes didn't use this example, but I studied physics for too long to not put a bit of knowledge from it into something. This is what we have so far then. If we have a clear and distinct idea of God as an infinite or perfect substance, this must be innate because we are unable to witness perfection or infinity here to create the idea ourselves. Every effect must have a cause, including ideas, which despite only having objective reality by the same logic as above, must have a source in actual reality somewhere. And as an infinite substance, God is the idea with the greatest objective reality, and so it must have an equally great actual reality somewhere. By all of these ideas together, he concludes that God must exist. If you want a super simplified shorthand to throw around tonight whenever you're explaining whatever your hyperfixation from today's video essay binge gave you, you could say, humans only remix pre-existing ideas they've witnessed, but perfection could not have been witnessed, and so how did we attain the idea of perfection? A perfect being must exist. Now, Descartes does consider some situations otherwise, that maybe he wasn't created by God, but by something else, and lands on 3, but really 2 possibilities. That he created himself, that an imperfect being created him, or that his parents created him. The last one slots into the second one, so we'll be discussing them as the same. Now, in debating if he created himself, Descartes reasons that he couldn't have, because if he has a conception of infinity or perfection, and he is the creator, then why would he be so imperfect? If he had the power to make himself and also has these ideas, then surely he would have created himself as much more perfect than this flawed human form. So moving on to the idea that he was created by an imperfect being, this is logical enough. it's entirely within his reasoning that such a being could make him. However, once again, if perfection exists as an idea, some cause must have created it, which couldn't have been the imperfect being. So that imperfect being must have a maker as well, and a cause for its effect, and this chain regresses infinitely until we consider some perfect or infinite being at the end of it once again. It's just adding more steps. As such, he concludes that God is real once more. Now, that covers Descartes' third meditation. As a 17th century translation, it's a bit difficult to read, and clearly the logic contained within is dated, sometimes circular, limited in its considerations, and superseded by thinking in the 400 years since. But that's also why it's only called a meditation, and I think it's interesting to look at it, if nothing else more than as an exercise in rationalist logic. If you spot flaws in it, and if you spot flaws in anything I'll say in the sections following it, which will occur because infinity is a strange concept, I encourage you to comment them below so that others can be aware of them. Now, this helps the video do better with the algorithm, and of course I'm asking in part due to that engagement factor, but also because there are going to be flaws in my logic and processes. I'm not perfect and have a lot left to learn on these topics, and the flaws present in that are increased due to me working on a 2-week schedule for each video. I simply wouldn't have the time to explore every refutation of this theory and still provide this video on time. But that's where you all come in. If you can help me add to that, then this piece becomes much more complete through a community effort, which also encourages discussion among other people instead of just one person's ideas, which will always produce a more well-rounded result. I think this makes it a win-win situation, and I'm comfortable asking for the help of comments because of that. But whatever the case there, we have some media analysis to get into. First up, we have Serial Experiments Lain, which meshes with this concept of God in 2 ways. The first is with Masami Eiri, a programmer who believes he has become God. Let's rewind a bit and explain how. In this world, there's something called the Wired, which is sort of like our internet, but more so the collection of all electronics communication-capable devices, which are tied together by sharing the same protocol. Eiri was instrumental in creating the next generation of that protocol, which is coming into effect during the events of the series. Having inserted his own memories into the code, Eiri gains consciousness in the Wired, and with the ability to control its workings, giving up his flesh and blood body in the process. This then pairs with some real-world conspiracy theories and misuse of scientific ideas, which means the Wired and the real world are merging into one thing. For example, it's like the number of connection points on Earth becoming the same as the number of neurons in the brain and simulating one mind, which should then provide Eiri with control over the whole thing since he is within that mind that is now the world, making him God. Well, these ideas are nonsense in reality, they are the canon of the show if we believe the narrator in episode 9. However, as we said, this isn't the case for the entire series. Through most of it, Eiri is present as a god in the Wired, but not yet as a god of the real world. Just a simple, disgruntled man back there, he has to rely on other individuals to enforce his will on Earth proper, using the Knights, a group of hacker-likes who help setting up this merging of the 2 worlds and accept Eiri as their god. Now, the way he describes this is in more dramatic wording, stating,
"With no one willing to worship me, I'm not really a god."
But with what he believes, we can pull that wording apart into something more logical, because we also consider that he believes the Wired is to be an upper layer of reality, something you have to ascend to. And as such, a being which has ascended already has inherently lost the ability to be a part of that lower world, the restrictions which it plays by. In this case, simply the body. I mean, think about it. Could you impact our world without a body? Even your words and ideas rely on a form to communicate them, a brain needed to comprehend them at the very least. So a god exists and is powerful, but to impact the lower world, they need people who know that and can act on it. In short, a god needs followers, as he believes. But this creates a logical fallacy. If God has an impact through its followers, then its followers are performing action through their belief. But how did they get that belief if it was unable to impact them with its actions to begin with? They both create and are created by God in this scenario. Well, knowing that he doesn't have domain over the real world, the solution to this fallacy can't be that he created them, as that would only form another contradiction with what we've already covered, and so we're left to assume that he is not an all-powerful God. As such, if we're following the causality logic in the Meditations, there must be a more powerful being which created him, since he has an idea of total godhood. His use of devices he didn't create in order to ascend is the same paradox. They allowed him to do so, yet he didn't create them. And this is what Lain, our main character and also godlike being, points out to him when he tries to control her.
What you did was to remove all the peripheral devices that interact with the wired. But without those, you couldn't have accomplished anything. So tell me, did you honestly come up with these ideas all by yourself?
You can see the logic of Descartes' statement in her quote. If he did not begin as God, then how did he come up with the idea of being a god to begin with? Unoriginal as he is, it must have come from something beyond him. He gets the point of this, responding with,
"No! Are you telling me there's been a god all along?"
And there was. Turns out, it's Lain. Lain, who at first seemed just to be a shy, odd girl, is the other side of our discussion, of course. And as the god who set all this in motion, her story really showcases an interesting consequence of how Descartes laid out the idea of God, and that's loneliness. Now, this assumes that God feels anything in the way that we do, but we feel those things for some reason embedded by it. And so there is some idea that they either might, or at least found it important enough that we should, right? While this could be easily pointed to as a flaw in what follows, I think it's interesting enough to be discussed anyway. Now, as Descartes laid out, God must always have a greater reality than its creations do. This must be a fact for any of that following logic to hold up as true. And we won't be questioning this, but looking at a consequence of it, because that means that we can never truly comprehend God, as doing so would mean we must hold just as great a degree of reality. We can have an idea of it, but we can't really understand it, which means we can never really interact with it. We've already seen this in the series with Eiri, a not all-powerful god. So, if we imagine a proper god in true form attempting to communicate with its beings, well, it would be even less possible and can explain some of the oddities we see in the show like this. As it progresses, which means as Lain gets closer and closer to being God, moments like this happen more and more, where Lain is in the real world, but not really in the real world, standing in human spaces but without human comprehension, seen by maybe one person, or even earlier in the series, seeing things that no one else can perceive. She can be there, but no one really can see her, and she can see things that aren't really there. And this makes sense, because she has a higher perception than them, so she should be able to see things that aren't there, that they couldn't. And if they could see her, then she couldn't be God, because humans can't perceive God. It's basically like that she's at so many times and places at once, existing in ways they could never know, that although she can see them, they can't see her. The most that gets through is one glance or a single line, because that's how long these human lives are to a god. Just one moment that they share. This is probably why, as the series progresses, more of her interactions happen among those who gave up their bodies to live on the wired instead, like Chisa and Eiri, because they don't share this limitation of the human body, this time and place, and so they could speak more properly with a god. So it's clear that God couldn't present itself as is when trying to interact, which leaves two other possibilities. It could either create another being on its level, or it could present itself in an imperfect form. Now, I originally wrote a section for the former option, but it doesn't actually happen in the show, so I'm going to cut it here to save your time. I encourage you to follow that logic yourself in a comment, once again both because it helps the video do well, but also for discussion, community, and your idea could be a lot better than mine was as well. For today, this leaves us with the second option, for God to present itself in a form that mortal beings could comprehend. Clearly, based on Lain existing as a mostly normal squirrel girl for most of the series, this is the path that she took, and I think it actually explains some of her shortcomings. Yes, people can actually see and understand her in this form, but they can only see and understand, well, some infinitesimally small portion of her, something on the scale of 1/1 trillionth. Imagine only being able to express the most minimal portion of yourself to the people around you, or else you fade out of their perception. Do you think you would be outgoing in any way, or mostly sit shyly and observe? This could explain why Lain is so reserved, such a minimal presence in these moments, who sticks mostly to herself and almost doesn't even feel like a complete person, because she simply isn't in this form. To her, being human at scale is just that uncomfortable and incomplete at all times. This could also explain the other selves that she witnesses throughout the series. A major plot point is that Lain, believing she's just a normal girl, is shocked to discover stories of her emerging that she doesn't recall. Legends of a crazy girl in clubs or a mischievous presence on the Wired, even though she hasn't used her Navi, this world's equivalent of a PC, in, well, maybe ever? Her dive into technophilia emerges only in trying to uncover these other selves and the chaos they cause. If it's true that Lain placed herself in a human form to be able to interact, then these other versions of her must exist, because a whole infinite being could certainly place themselves into a lesser form, but they wouldn't be able to actually rid themselves of being a perfect entity, as they'd have to exist in all times and places. Infinity simply can't be made to be finite. And so if she's interacting with humans, there would need to be these other pieces, which if they are facing the same form of limitation as the one we follow in the story, would also have a will and be able to interact just as she does, but as different personalities, of course. Now, wouldn't she be aware of this though? How could anything be kept from her as an infinite being? Well, because she has to not be consciously perceptive of that fact in order to be on the same level as human beings to begin with. If she was aware as to what the rest of her unlimited self was doing, then she would just as well be existing in multiple places and at times at once, which is just making herself far too beyond to be perceived, as we see in the latter parts of the anime previously discussed. The lack of awareness is key to the ability to interact with us. Now, clearly, from everything we've covered, this state of being just isn't satisfactory to Lain at all, which is likely why she's chasing down these other selves with so much vigor. Without knowing it, it's like recollecting the parts of herself as she slowly reawakens as God and gains control over her powers again, reaching her baseline level of satisfaction once more. The more this happens, the more the worlds merge, the more godlike she is, and that's basically the plot progressing. This hits its most crucial point in episode 11, where Lain actually merges herself in the Wired in full, and from there can alter the world entirely at will. With this ability, and still holding the desire for interaction, we witness something interesting. What if she brings a human closer to her level? Is there a point where they could understand each other? This is what happens with one real friend she has, Alice, the only one of the group who didn't just kind of soft bully her, actually staying by her side when questioned by the police and more like that. However, this relationship is strained when the worst parts of Lain on the Wired begin to spread Alice's secrets, namely her infatuation with the teacher and how she acts on it, ruining her ability to live a normal social life as a teen. Of course, the Lain she actually knows didn't do this, which she tries to explain, but the explanation does no good. How could a finite being be satisfied by an explanation of multiple selves and forms beyond time and place? Unable to comprehend this, all Alice can see is lies. So, to attempt and prove that Lain wasn't trying to hurt her, she has to bridge that gap somehow, be able to both communicate with Alice and show she cares at once. Well, worlds are infinite to a god, so why doesn't she do what's essentially like a little gift to a perfect being? Make one perfect world for them. One where everyone is personable and no one knows any secrets and everything is easy. That's exactly what should work, right? So long as she leaves Alice as the one person to remember the other world, it elevates her friend out of human limitations, like consequence, so that they may still communicate, while also expressing care. Everyone in this world has forgotten her secrets, and it's great. There's an issue though. A godlike being can mentally and emotionally withstand a reality that only they remember because, while they exist across all of them, it's par for the course. But Alice, a normal girl being elevated to that status so suddenly, that's mental torture. She goes to school expecting to be hounded for these spread secrets, and she isn't. That's good. But what happens instead is that she's alone. In remembering a world that no one else does, she's experiencing the same kind of loneliness that Lain does. How can she interact with anyone in this state, where she has no idea if they've shared the same moments anymore? If the girls that once bullied Lain are now her best friends, then does Alice even really know them anymore? Nothing can be validated by others. Nothing in this world can be proven true to her, and so she simply starts to feel insane. Has anything she's ever known or experienced been real? She cries this all out to Lain when she finds her, saying,
"Why did you only leave my memories alone? Tell me, what have I ever done to you for you to hate me so much?"
And that's exactly the issue we started with, that God can't properly communicate with a human because their perspective is so different. In giving up all of her human limitations, what Lain believes is beneficial and what Alice believes is beneficial simply grow too far apart for them to have a healthy connection. If you've seen the Owl House, it's like a collector situation, where he doesn't understand that people can die, and that codes how he interacts with them. Lain doesn't do that, but she fails to remember that to someone whose consciousness has only ever existed in one world, essentially existing in two would pretty much break their mind. But she does it anyway because she understands it as good, so someone else would, right? Now, Alice is able to remind her of this fact, the restrictions of the human body and their value to mortal life, in sharing her heartbeat with Lain. As they sit there and share in it together, they form a point of true connection over something very simple, a sensation, not unlike enjoying the same meal, for example. But that's exactly the point. Lain's forgotten those things, the simple ones which humans can know and enjoy. So long as those are lacking from her perspective, she can never truly exist among humans. So in the end, with Alice even further traumatized by a fight between gods, forms emerging from nothingness and playing out in horrific shapes, there's only one thing Lain can do: reset the world to a state where she never existed at all, and allow everything to live like that. Condensing the last of her other selves, she watches on from the sidelines forever, catching some small conversations here and there, but never anything more. In all times and all places, she, God, is alone. This next one is less of an objection directly to the ideas that Descartes lays out, and more of a frustration which comes from logic found in infinity. Namely, that perfection can justify everything, so does it truly create an argument worthy of debate? We find an example of how this impacts a being in Angel's Egg, a very abstract movie from the director of Ghost in the Shell. The world it takes place in is quite simple. A young girl awakes in this large structure, almost ark-like, sitting on the horizon with a large egg. Taking it with her, she traverses across plains through unknown wetlands, landing in an old town beyond, inhabited only by statues who awaken to fulfill a singular purpose before sleeping once more, with stores whose shelves no longer have real food but merely condiments and refuse which she uses to sustain herself. It is a bleak, ruined world, absolutely lonely and without a hint of hope. As the only being left truly alive, how could this girl achieve anything? What does her existence matter for? Well, it's for the egg. Contained within it is, well, she doesn't actually know. Later on, she does make a claim as to what it is when given an idea by someone else, but most times she just says that she doesn't know what's contained within, or has at least forgotten at some point in the past, as we'll later see could be possible. There's a chance that it would be nothing, just an empty shell, or it could be the angel which provides rebirth to this world, an absolute salvation where there once seemed to be nothing at all. This lack of certainty, that is the infinite possibilities the egg contains, is exactly why the girl persists as a human in this world with almost no reason to be one. Because so long as it holds the possibility of saving this world, it makes no sense to give up, right? To do so is simply to accept failure as a guarantee when there's still a chance of success. Something I have highlighted as important time and time again based on that logic of possibility being infinite. That technically, always and everywhere, there is a chance, however slim, so we might as well take it. I always say this is important because look what it does. Contrast her to these statues. They are static beings, quite literally. The idea of fishermen in the past who emerged to chase the shadows of fish appearing on the walls of the town. They rush forward rapidly, throw their spears and break the windows, the walls, destroy this last bastion of civilization, and capture nothing for it. because there are no fish, there are only shadows. Maybe this world was once prosperous, full of fish that they fueled feasts and celebration with, and in their singular focus they destroyed the supply, doomed themselves. Maybe these statues were the ones to further bring its ruin, so caught up in one possibility that they failed to understand how unlimited their options truly were, so much that even once the purpose was long dead, they still couldn't let it go. With no purpose, they simply exist mechanically, harming their only space time and time again with nothing more. As a contrast to the girl in the egg, which she carries far and wide to new places, to pick up new flasks, to simply do anything different at all, they show the importance of that fact. Without any idea of infinity, the world and we would become entirely too finite. The concept broadens our horizons, widens our actions, and makes us aware that we may not be infinite, but we are certainly not totally finite either. We have to embrace this impossible standard to some degree. However, that's only half the story, as we lack the full context of the girl's existence. Eventually, another being does emerge, a boy creeping forth from a line of biomechanical tanks with bandages over his palm and a cross on his back. His goal at first is clearly observation, as he steals the egg from her but returns it, declaring that he won't destroy her purpose and means her no harm, even with the greatest chance anyone has had to do so. While she's weary of his presence at first, he acts as a protector from the statue's mad rush, and she comes to trust him as they return to her ark. Here, he sees what changes the whole story. These flasks she collects on her outings to the town, lining every single edge of this massive space. The stairs, the floors, every possible space is adorned with them. Knowing that she can only gather one of these a day from what we've seen so far, this is how long she's existed here. Even if she denies it, we know from watching her that this is true. She likely simply has forgotten that each one marks a day because each one marks a day. It has been that long. With this in mind, and the egg as her only form of motivation possible, a chill sets in. How long has it been waiting to hatch? How many, not days or weeks or months has it been here, but how many years? How many lifetimes? Considering this amount of age, what the girl is doing isn't exploring, but rather repeating. Nothing new, but only a constant cycle of what's old over and over. Is this why she somehow hasn't grown in all this time? She may be more flesh than stone, but without change, she is a statue still. Maybe she's even worse. The lack of food in all these stores, that's on her, not the statues, because she's the only one using it to fuel a pointless existence. If they at least accept their stasis without asking for sustenance, she keeps up an appearance of change just to consume what's needed for it, and then to not do it. She's just as pointless as everything else in this world. She merely can't be honest about it, taking an excuse in the egg to keep lying. Yes, the idea of infinity did keep her going, but did anything good actually come from her having gone on for so long? If anything, she simply fails to understand her own world from this, finds herself an outcast, detached from the real world by this concept which doesn't actually exist. Maybe there's somewhere better in this world, somewhere beyond just this one town, but in trying so much to protect the egg, she never found it, keeping possibility safe in its ark nest instead. It wasn't pushing her forward, it was holding her back, and we see this when she loses it. The boy begins to question her, gauging her perception of the world. He asks about a sound. She says it's the egg breathing, but he knows it's her own breath. She says she can hear wings beating inside of it, but he knows it's the wind outside. The egg, as something so impossibly beyond her, as a concept of infinity, has made her unable to realize her own power, her own functions even. Since the egg could be everything, everything must be the egg, and so she must be nothing in comparison, right? Everything, even the simple act of her continuing to exist in respiration, must be for and from it, with nothing for or from her. Infinity has ruined her, made her not better than the statues, but worse, unable to see what she truly is, the world that she's within. And so the boy revokes this. Waiting until she's asleep and turning away from the egg, he grabs it from her, lays it on the ground, and breaks it open. She awakes and finds the pieces and not another thing. There was nothing inside. The task was pointless, nothing more than excuse in the end. running out of the ark after him, she falls into the chasms which have emerged and the floodwaters which have rose, and she ages, turning from this girl into a woman instead, as the landscape around her has entirely shifted to show the egg as parasite, leeching life from the world around her through thick, dark roots, exactly as the boy described it. Likely this is a representation of her own perception. She simply wasn't seeing what herself or the world had become until the egg was taken away from her, infinity removed, and she was forced to witness it all. This is probably what the world always looked like. She was just unable to witness it. This age is what she probably was. All this time she should have had the greater capacities of an adult. All this time where she should have been destroying the egg to save this world. Instead, she was stuck as a child, protecting it, knowing nothing. Infinity blinds us. It makes our arguments infallible, and in doing so, removes the true conflict that forces us to grow, leeches the world down into nothingness as we develop nothing new but remain ever comfortable nonetheless. Whatever lies beyond, we are limited creatures, and while chasing perfection can drive us forward, accepting it as a fact can hold us back way worse than anything else. The best thing a truly infinite being could do, as the boy may be a part of, is to break the egg, destroy the confirmation of the idea, and leave us to our devices to become better as we need, not as they would need. A God who doesn't do so may be the one failing us. Now, if we move past my gripes with perfection as an endless argument, we can debate if it existing is even possible, or if it would defeat itself by existing. We'll examine this with psychopaths, which I think I'm summarizing for about the 20th time now, so we'll keep it fairly short. In the year 2112, Japan is the last stable nation on Earth thanks to the Sybil system, the means of reading a person's intent from the most advanced computing network ever. This allows for the determination of aptitudes, leading to career placements and life decisions made by the system, as well as the prevention of crimes before they occur. The mere intent to commit one is now indicative of criminality. Existing as a special case within this framework is Shogo Makishima, a man who's criminally asymptomatic. Essentially, he lacks empathy and as such can't be read by the system as intending to perform or even carrying out a crime. With this unique perspective, he sees the world from the outside and finds it horrid. With the absolute convenience of prescribed lives, no one knows what true importance is. They've never felt what it means to lose, and so gain means nothing. Never had a stressful moment to turn them into someone stronger. This extends to connections, to art, to everything, a world devoid of free will. Even those he provides free will to, carrying out their intent with his physical action, well, they simply dig deeper into their own comforts, lack originality, or bastardize ideals to justify animalistic behavior, the same disease with a different name. Now, the reason we included all of that in the summary is because of how it develops the world. It's one which is extremely limited, to the point that even if directly gifted the ability to act outside of its bounds, people still remain within them. Yes, the physicality of their actions seems outside, but the meaning behind it, what people think is possible for a human soul, is still within the limits that Sybil has set. This explains how the Sybil system has achieved perfection, because there are at least two ways. You can either grow to fill the entire container, or you can shrink the entire container until you fill it. They've done the latter, the option limitation, because through and through that's what Sybil is. In solely determining what is and isn't a crime, they can have any kind of dissent from their ideas entirely wiped from the general population, as criminals are kept in isolation and no regular citizen interacts with them. You'd add this to the very act of determining what crime is and isn't to begin with, which is inherently about restricting people, as well as laying out paths for the citizens to follow in life, and you get people who are entirely bound to these ideas. Of course, those who existed beforehand know it's an unfair situation, but they either conform or are locked away forever, so they have no impact either way. Meanwhile, this persists for long enough that entirely new generations are raised under the framework you've established, and it goes from being limitation to simply being the extent of reality as people know it. The container is effectively shrunk. We see this with Akane, our main character and rookie inspector. She's born and raised in the era of Sybil and has extremely high aptitudes by all of its judgments, just about their prime citizen. taking a job at the MWPSB, the few humans who deal with any of its criminals who do manage to cause actual harm, she's privy to the cases that most citizens would never see, and this is her reaction to someone becoming a criminal.
Why would somebody choose to let their hue get so cloudy over receiving treatment?
To her, crime is entirely a choice on the individual. These are not people acting as humans act, but rather entirely against how humans should act. The world and the systems they are within do not have flaws. These people are the flaws. Sybil has clearly reduced the scope of this world down to achieve relative perfection, an absolute paradox of terms. But it is true, our concept of infinity is related to our concept of being finite, the containers we are within determining what we can comprehend. For example, if we didn't conceive of time, then we wouldn't list outside of time as a component of perfection, would we? Now, perfection could clearly exist in forms that we don't have an idea of because it is beyond us. But doesn't this mean that we lack a clear and distinct idea of a perfect being? If our concept of infinity doesn't resemble actual infinity, then there need be no source of actual infinity. After all, someone in the world of psychopaths would have a different, clear, and distinct idea of what perfection means, and yet free will wouldn't be included in it, as they don't comprehend such a thing. This means that the objective reality of the idea within us cannot really be the most possible since it has variance, and from there the logic that relates back to God can no longer stand. You can argue from cause and effect alone there must be some originator, but that's a much less strong argument. So that alone doesn't mean perfection ceases to exist, but it does have some implications for how stable perfection is. We start to find this in how the operation of Sybil is described. In a way, the theory is more important than the practice. The head of the MWPSB, Chief Kase, says,
"It's more important we merely believe it's so than the Sybil system does function perfectly every time."
Ideally, Sybil should not actually have a physical presence, but should just be assumed to be working everywhere all at once. Consider this. You're in a square walking around and shopping as a few drones buzz past you and the automated scanners overhead turn and watch. There's about 10 of them in total. While this increased presence seems to say that you're very watched and can't do anything, maybe 3 of them are even seeing you at once, it can also imply that there's a flaw in the system. Why would they use 10 of these scanners in different locations and with the ability to move if each one was actually capable of surveying a large area? Why would 3 need to be trained on you all at once if they had enough capacity for the whole plaza? Their range must actually be quite limited, and the pattern in which they're spread out can give you hints as to how that is. As in, if you see 2 of them back to back, then you know their effective range isn't 360. And if the spacing is, say, 10 meters apart, then you can guess each one covers somewhere around 5 meters in distance. So say you find somewhere else where it's the same model of scanner, but 15 meters apart due to some oversight. You could probably pass through that area without being scanned. Each new physical enforcement of Sybil provides more indications of just how flawed that physical enforcement is. And we see this be used multiple times in the series, as characters like Masatake Mido and Che Gusung regularly move about in the world with high crime coefficients, but without ever being picked up on a scanner. They were able to draw out pathways and times to take them at, which entirely avoided the range of this equipment, which is only possible because it has such a presence. This is a flaw which exists so long as there is any number of physical enforcements more than just one, because if it was perfect, why would there be redundancy? But say some years down the line, when the only people alive are those born under Sybil, they come out and remove all the scanners, leaving only one unknown a tower, and claiming that it is indestructible, eternally powered, and can read all intents at once everywhere. Of course this isn't true, physically it's just impossible, but that's exactly why perfection is achieved in theory and not in practice, because there is one thing that can be everywhere, and that's an idea. If everyone is thinking something at the same time, say that they're being watched, then they will behave as if they're being watched just in case. Everyone does this, no one sees anyone else not doing so, and it just becomes assumed as true. This is then preserved from danger as there's no pattern to go on to understand its flaws, so no one is able to truly know if they're moving around it or not, and this can be reduced even further if they publicly arrest random individuals claiming that they were intending to do so. Since there's no actual energy draw, it can't be traced or taken offline, every point of failure is removed, and you've effectively made an abstract idea into physical reality with no presence at all, an odd consequence of the human mind creating reality as we know it. And once this has then become the prevailing feeling, it becomes pretty hard to break, because people could witness a crime occurring in front of them, but would be unable to believe that it was a crime because, well, crime isn't real anymore. It's outside of the bounds of reality. We see this happen directly in Psychopaths, with a woman being violently murdered in the street, and not a single bystander doing anything but watching or even recording it, because as some comment to the police, they thought it was just a weird performance. Sybil clearly wouldn't allow such a thing to really happen, especially not so blatantly. Is there any way to break this idea? Well, yes, it actually was just broken right in front of them, despite the lack of recognition, and while that lack is terrifying, it did still happen, and super easily at that. In fact, everyone believing it was so perfect made it easier. If even just one person would have stepped forward, then the crime couldn't have been committed. So yes, the idea has made it impossible to recognize, but has also made the action infinitely easy. This is the weird, almost paradox of the system being perfect. No one can actually intend to commit a crime, yet if someone did, then they would be free to do so entirely. The closer to perfect something becomes, the easier it is to destroy with a single flaw. However, this does provide them with an interesting opportunity. You never have to correct yourself. Any flaw can simply become the means to catch dissent. We find this in how easily Makishima and Che are able to discern its location. The MWPSB says that processing happens at locations all around the city, but analyzing this data transfer shows that it's simply being passed somewhere else, with each transmission sharing Nona Tower as a common point. So they dig into the construction plans for that spot, and see that the original documents list a very large number of basement floors, while the current documents only list a few. The conclusion is easy: something crucial to Sybil is being hidden down there, and anyone could see that from this information. Sure, they tried vaguely to create a different idea than this, but all the data to prove it false exists where it could have easily been deleted. So why didn't they? Well, because they shouldn't have to. If everything is functioning properly, then anyone who digs into that information is going to have ill intent because there's no good reason to be doing so. They'll be listed as a criminal and then be caught swiftly from that intent. If instead Sybil deletes and tries to hide this data, well then they are the ones to have done something suspicious, and anyone looking into this can be doing so with good intent, wondering why government data has been altered or deleted. They won't be flagged as such by the scans, and could keep digging deeper and deeper until they reach the same conclusion as Makishima and Che, without ever actually committing a criminal act. The flaw being present is actually better cover for them than the flaw being hidden, as well as being a proof of their perfection that it can sit there and go entirely unnoticed, and not a single soul even able to conceive of their most poor deception. It's something they likely keep around because it feeds the ego a bit. Of course, this all didn't work here, but that's because Makishima is a special case. Assuming that there won't be some factor from outside their bounds like that, the system entirely prevents anything from inside from ever causing a problem. However, a flaw from outside is guaranteed because, remember, they didn't grow to be perfect, but shrunk to make it seem perfect. This means there are always outlier cases just like Makishima, who orchestrated the whole public murder incident. He had a helmet produced which bypasses the scanners by copying the profile of a nearby non-criminal, allowing the wearer to behave however they wish, assuming a regular citizen is nearby. Seeing that it did work, and having the news of it becoming public, he's able to share the helmets to a wider audience who now know that they will work and will act on that knowledge. Pharmacies are mugged, schools are raided, and students are burned. Riots break out wide scale, and no one is safe because the MWPSB can't properly respond with their super minimal staff, which was purposely kept that way as such for the illusion that they weren't needed. The flaw keeps spreading even further, a wildfire burning down the city unmanaged as a direct consequence of the idea of its perfection. That's part of the problem. It can exist as an idea, the space of the mind, but the body always wins in the end. Because even if we can't use those sensations to prove anything, as far as we feel, they still occur, right? And if you put someone in immense pain, do you think they'll be comprehending of infinity? No, they'll be trying to stop the pain, just as we see in psychopaths. Sure, this crowd can easily watch someone else being beaten because there's a choice in the sensation, in sight, where you can look away or close your eyes. You don't have to observe anything visually. But once it's more widespread, like these classrooms, it begins to be a matter not of sight, but of pain, a sensation you can't help. When you're the one being beaten, when your friend is the one being killed, it's not possible to be in the realm of ideas because the real world pain is contradicting it. Never stressed before in their lives, these citizens are unable to exist in this real space and seek to recreate the theory of absolute safety in insanity, counter-rioting and killing anyone who's wearing, worn, or is even suspected of once wearing a helmet because they need absolute certainty as a base condition for functioning. That's just how their world works, right? Absolute safety is included in the definition of what they know. Crime isn't possible as a fact of the world, and so they have to make sure crime is impossible. The perfect vessels of Sybil, the ideal citizens, are easily converted into the thing destroying it in these counter-riots. That's the thing. The idea has never mattered to them, only the results. Thoughts don't create feelings. Feelings create thoughts. So the more things shrink to make Sybil perfect, the less it will ever actually matter. If it goes away, then people will just embody it themselves because that's what they think reality is. Even if they become fully anarchistic, the guiding principle is still there, right? With no definition of crime from a lack of organized structure, then it can't exist. When we consider how easily the idea defeats itself, and then how little that fact matters to people, I think it's just logical to assume that perfection doesn't really exist, for the same reason that everything is pretty much the same as nothing. Sure, one is an endless space existing forever, and one is the complete inability to exist, but what is existing in an endless space with no contrast but failing to exist? There's no context to know that you're actually there, that anything is happening, and as such they're just the same thing. If perfection is like infinity, if it's every good thing and every bad thing, then isn't it just no things? And if it's just the good things, then it isn't everything, so it's lacking that quality of perfection and would defeat itself still. This raises a whole host of questions about what is good and what is bad also, lines of questions relying on nonsensical principles, and so you get a feeling of exactly why Sybil shrunk the world rather than expanding it. There is no way to properly define perfection. You can only ever simulate it in a certain space. The outliers will always exist, and it will always defeat itself. For a brief entry, we can just question the underlying principle that experience cannot lead to true knowledge with The Egg, a famous short story. There's not much to say in context of the text. A man dies in a car crash and finds himself talking to God afterwards. While speaking briefly about the accident, the man worried for how his family will fare, it is pretty quickly revealed that he will be reincarnated, and back in time at that, to the life of a peasant girl in the year 540. But it's not time travel, it's just how things are. The man is everyone who has existed at all times, in all places, being reincarnated through every single life in order to attain godhood himself. He's both the murderer and the murdered, and everyone in between. Every single act has been for and against himself at once. That's that. There's nothing else to it. God is the sum of all experiences that life has ever had. I bring this story up because of that simplicity. A part of why it's so effective is that it's easily understood. Think of all the hoops Descartes' ideas had us jumping through, layer after layer of complicated and questionable leaps of logic, and having to start from the base assumption of nothing, even though we as humans literally experience before we begin to consciously form memories. It's hard to follow his logic. I mean, I read this text twice across the months from when I was introduced to it and making this video, and then watched a couple explainer videos, which themselves either stressed very different aspects or didn't agree on what the logic actually meant. It's a cool exercise, and I think an important one too, but it's not something intuitive. Meanwhile, The Egg, taking an empirical approach, is easily understood. We live, we gather experience, and we form a well-rounded base of knowledge from doing so. As a human, it's impossible to escape this pattern. So as everyone understands this, we can easily form a conception of God as simply being the sum of all experiences. If to explain everything which we know has existed, will exist, and could exist from nothing more than the logic of us having lived. Now, we may recall that experience may be questionable, right? How can we trust our senses to know that this has even happened? Well, if we take the same assumption that we exist in order to be deceived in the first place, then we know that senses exist, which are activated and have effects which result from that. Every person exists, every person is deceived or witnesses truth through their senses to some degree, and then if you sum that all up, what you get is everything, infinity, like God. Why does deception matter if it's just a possible experience that God can create and have? It's just something they can understand, a truth that we, limited beings, fail to see within. At one point, Descartes recalls our idea of perfection almost like a maker's mark. God left it in us so that we could recognize him and prove him, and thus be able to worship and the like. Considering this, and generally the idea of in his image and so on, it doesn't seem like a leap in logic to say that our faculties are based on faculties that God also has to some greater extent. So why should it follow that we even distrust them to begin with, once again getting to deception? If anything, maybe that falsehood we feel is simply because things are too advanced for us, able to perceive aspects beyond our minds, because they're a maker's mark left in us as proof of God. The mind could be the flawed part of this equation, misinterpreting real signals rather than receiving flawed signals. Now, this isn't to say that the empirical-based definition of God we see in the egg is without flaws. It necessitates determinism, because to be every action, then every action needs to already have happened. We could solve this for God, because we simply say they aren't bound to the same idea of time that we are, but that doesn't make it feel any better for us, as there's no free will under this framework. Which, well, then that gets into a whole problem of evil debate, because if we have a world without free will, then the major argument against the problem of evil falls apart. So in that sense, the rationalist definition actually holds up better in other respects than the empirical one. That's kind of the point in the end. There is no one answer which can be summed up in a nice package of words. There are just true ideas spread out amongst them in some situations, becoming false in others, and we pick and choose as life progresses to make sense of a world so far beyond us. At least as far as we can perceive, nothing will ever be perfect in our lives, now or ever, and we have to live with that fact somehow, that somewhere out there in conception exists a perfect self, a perfect life, and we're forever barred from it. It's because of that I don't believe in God. For how I've come to understand the world, how my experiences and feelings have forced my thoughts to justify, the healthiest thing I can do is believe in my free will and the meaninglessness of all things, that we're here and then we're gone, and that's all the reason why. Yes, it terrifies me, but within that terror is the energy to create, to understand, to live, and to come to terms with what I know myself to be and what I can never achieve. I move forward because the world and I are deeply flawed, and there is no salvation in the end, so I have to make the best of it right now. But it's also because of that same fact that I appreciate a set of people who do believe in God, because they use the concept for the same reason as me, to make sense of what they've experienced and live a healthier life, to not be motivated by terror in the end, but peace in the end. Their desire and needs are different from mine, so why should they not use a different method to reach the same place? Does that justify hate? Does that justify a lack of exploration? Not at all. But if to them it justifies being the best person they can be, then it's justified enough to me. We're all just making sense of the things we never have enough time and energy to comprehend, and so as long as we're making an attempt which keeps us growing, changing as the times do to adapt and be good, then, well, at least we're on the right path, and maybe someday in the future the work we did today will be looked back on as simple and mundane because they have found more of an answer than we knew. Maybe they'll be closer to that impossible concept. So we recognize that it doesn't exist, and that our quest for it is utterly flawed, and then we do it anyway. The flawed gods of our own little realities.